From smart cities to smart nations. Well, there's some people who think we can't do business as usual anymore because our financial, transportation, and health systems are broken. This is what Sandy Penland said some time ago. Geoffrey West had a very similar opinion, and actually I think about it in a similar way too. When we talk about transportation systems, then we often have these noble goals, you know, so we imagine cities to be more or less free of traffic, and we can sit outside in a cafe and it's nice and everything, but in fact this is the reality. So a lot of traffic jams, a lot of noise, a lot of pollution, and very annoying urban gridlock. So the question is, do we have to live with it? Or can we overcome that kind of situation? And in fact, the flow to a center, which seems to be the problem that we cannot solve, because it's kind of implied by the principle of concentration towards the center, this problem has been solved by every single cell of our body. Because we have a transportation systems in cells too. So there are microtubuli, and along these microtubuli there is a transport going on of certain kind of chemical materials. And of course, these materials go to the nucleus, and there is a concentration towards the center too. However, if there would be congestion, then this would be really terrible. In fact, there are some diseases where these transportation processes in the cell are congested, but these are really terrible diseases. So nature figured it out, but it also had a long time for this. The question is, can we learn something from nature? Can we come up with an entirely new organizational principle for cities? And in fact, we need to understand what the problem really is. And a lot of it has to do with unstable dynamics. Here why this movie doesn't work. So you can see here, it's not a difficult task. It seems to drive a car in a circle, but nevertheless, after a very short time period, you will see that a traffic jam forms. Now we have this traffic jam, and it's moving backwards, and we can't get rid of it anymore. But the question is, why is this happening? And if you would talk to drivers, they would probably say, oof, there was a stupid driver in front of me, and he or she didn't know how to drive a car. But it has nothing to do with this. Why can I say this? Because there are mathematical equations that allow us to understand what's the reason for these kind of phenomena. And basically what these equations say is, when the density exceeds a certain threshold, then traffic flow becomes unstable, and the slightest variation of the speeds would be amplified actually. So the next driver would respond with a delay, but in order to compensate for this delay, he would have to tip the brake a little bit harder, and the next one even harder, and so on. So they're braking more and more, and as a result of this cascade effect or domino effect, finally traffic comes to a rest, although nobody wants to stop. Now this is just a typical example for systemic instability, which could be circumscribed as a phenomenon where the system would get out of control sooner or later, even if you have a lot of information, good technology, well-skilled people, and the very best intentions. What happens here is just the opposite of what people want to happen. And it happens just at the time where we need all the capacity of the road. Instead, we have a capacity drop. That means we lose capacity. The very same freeway, after this capacity drop, when congestion has formed, can transport less vehicles. So the situation becomes even worse. There are similar problems when the density in pedestrian crowds exceeds a certain threshold. Under normal conditions, we find these beautiful lane formation phenomena that needs smooth flows, good coordination, as if it was steered by an invisible hand. However, in large densities, the situation can get totally out of control, and we might have crowd disasters as we've seen it in many different places. In fact, every single year we have crowd disasters, and people die even though nobody wants to kill anybody. So why is this? Again, because a situation occurs which is unstable and therefore uncontrollable. It's cascade effects, and these cascade effects might be even more pronounced actually in networks. So a single perturbation can actually mess up the entire system as a result of such kind of cascade effects. And this looks like a funny experiment. In fact, it's a visualization of chain reactions as we have them in nuclear materials. So it's behind atomic bomb explosion, but also what's going on actually in a nuclear power station. And so we know these kind of phenomena are controllable in principle, but they're difficult to control. Sometimes they're getting out of control, as we've seen in Chernobyl or Fukushima. And unfortunately, this is not just a theoretical experiment. These kind of things happen also in reality, as we've seen after Lehman Brothers got bankrupt. It caused a bankruptcy of hundreds of banks, and that cost actually hundreds of billions of dollars that we, the taxpayers, probably finally have to pay. Similar phenomena can be observed in electrical power grids, so blackouts, as it happened, for example, in 2006, in November. A single line was switched off, of course, after a computer simulation was made. A ship had to be transported from one side to the other. That was the reason. And it turned out that one of the line failed accidentally, and that caused actually blackouts all over Europe in many unlinked places. So it's a pretty hard to understand pattern, but nevertheless these kind of phenomena can be simulated, as you can see over here. These are movies that were produced as supplementary material of a +1 paper, and as you can see, the blackouts, the most serious blackouts might happen in far remote places, while actually in neighboring places there might still be electricity. And things become even more serious if we have complex interdependencies in networks of networks or systems of systems. And then we have to look at this risk interconnection map that the World Economic Forum is actually preparing every single year. And you can see that more or less all systems are connected with other systems, and so they could be potential cascade effects, and that could be very costly or harmful. Interestingly enough, now the greatest challenges are in the economic sector, in the governance sector, and in the social sector. That hasn't always been like this. Well, let's look a little bit into a particular example, namely a blackout. So what happens after a blackout of electricity? Well, of course, traffic lights would also be off. That means public and private transport are actually down. We can also not pump gas, so cars would just stand on the road. We would most likely have an overload of the phone network, so communication would break down too. Water wouldn't be pumped. As a result, it might be contaminated, and then we would have to boil the water that we have, but on the other hand, most likely that will cause some fires. Of course, that happens with a certain probability, and so one thing comes to another thing. We have these kind of cascade effects, and if you look at this in more detail, what happens during disasters, for example during thunderstorms, then you can see there are many things that can be direct or indirect effects of such kind of disasters. And that actually makes it a disaster in the end, that it has such a big systemic effect. Nevertheless, there's some systematic, there's some logic, there's some causal interrelationships, and we can use this causal interrelationship basically to anticipate what might happen. And as a result, we can actually prepare for these kind of things. So we can take proactive measures because we can guess what are the things that are likely to happen next. They might not always happen, but they can happen, and this is what basically this diagram says. So we can prepare, and in certain kind of situations, actually, one disaster could cause another disaster. For example, an earthquake might cause a tsunami, and as we've seen, a tsunami in Japan caused actually a disaster in the nuclear power station. So one thing comes to another thing, and all these kind of things, however, can be analyzed beforehand in many cases. We can do that for earthquakes, and for thunderstorms, for wildfires, for volcano outbreaks, and so on. But there are also some common elements, actually, of disasters, and this is kind of summarized over here. Now, let me just illustrate one recent example. So, as you know, we had this Fukushima disaster in the nuclear power station. So, as a result, actually, in countries such as Germany or Switzerland, it was decided that we want to change our energy system and basically replace nuclear power by other power. And so the question is, what kind of power could be used? Well, certainly solar power comes to mind. In fact, there was a huge project planned where basically Africa should have produced solar energy for the entirety of Europe. That should have been a $1,000 billion project. And as you know, it didn't come, and we'll soon see why it didn't come. So then the question is, what about gas? Well, gas is basically produced for Europe in 3 regions. It's also Northern Africa, it's Russia, and it's Scandinavia, and 2 of these regions are politically a bit shaky. So then, should we maybe invest into the creation of biofuels? In fact, people have done that, in particular also because of global warming. And however, producing biofuels takes land away that would otherwise be available to produce food. And in other words, food becomes more expensive. And as you can see, food prices peaked, and as a result, actually, we had the Arab Spring. That triggered the Arab Spring, and as a result of the Arab Spring, the political situation in Africa became unstable, and that's why we had to give up on the Desertec project. So, as you can see, a lot of different systems are interconnected worldwide. The energy systems, with the food system, with the climate system, with the political system. So we really need to understand these systems better, and we need to build more resilient systems. In fact, this can be done to some extent at least, and one important point is actually modular design. Another point is that we should have redundancies or backup strategies or alternatives. Diversity is very important, and there are a number of other things too. So in particular, engineered breaking points seem to be really important to stop cascades. And in fact, every one of us has this at home. Because if there's a local overload in our electricity network at home, we don't want our flat to burn down. And that's why we have this pretty cheap device which interrupts the electrical currents. And it's very effective, besides actually we can change a few links, and changing a few links within this electrical power grid actually would make the system much more stable with regard to perturbations. It's also possible to look into the gas supply network, and in fact what we came up with was a fairness-based strategy that was pretty much inspired by the way the internet is organized. Of course, suppose in one area we wouldn't have deliveries anymore for whatever reasons, then we would have to basically get along with 2/3 of the gas supply. And obviously, if just the countries who can pay most would get all this gas and other countries wouldn't get anything, we would soon have a terrible crisis and most likely war, right? So if you want to cope with such a situation, it's very important that you find a way to make sure that everyone has a minimum of supply, so everyone can get along, even if it's a little bit of pain. And in fact, it turns out this can pretty much be done if you apply the right kind of strategy, but this has to be prepared for before a crisis. So you need to have the protocols how you basically distribute limited resources, scarce resources. So for sure, we have new possibilities. Data and computers can now help us to master these problems much better than before, and this is partly because computer power is exploding exponentially, data are exploding exponentially, and so we can build new instruments to explore the world. People now say data is the new oil, so you can make business with it, you can make a lot of money with it, but you could also say models are the new gold and participation means social capital. So it's not just data that counts, you really have to think about how to get raw data in the first place, and then the question is how to refine these raw data into useful information and then applicable knowledge. And this is what Future ICT was about. So the main components are shown over here. There was a planetary nervous system that was there to basically sense and understand what's going on, to turn data into information, and then the living Earth simulator should take this data in order to simulate systems and the options that we have, alternatives, the applications of the actions that we might take. That means the opportunities and risks associated with them, and basically in this way turn information into knowledge and look at what-if scenarios. And then finally, the global participatory platform was there to turn knowledge into wisdom. That was the idea. And let me go a little bit into the details now. So I started with the planetary nervous system, and so the idea is to create more sustainability and resilience through collective ICT-enabled awareness. And of course, now we have a lot of information that we can generate, and this information allows us to get a picture of what's going on in the world. And one very nice example is actually OpenStreetMap. That's a crowdsourced way of producing a map of all the streets and pathways in the world. In fact, it started very small, but then within just a few years, actually, it spread worldwide and became really a global movement. Now there are 1.5 million volunteers that feed data into the system, and we made it really a powerful platform. And in principle, you can also apply this to 3D crowdsourcing of our world. That means we can take the photographs that people put out on the web and then put them together. So these are the positions of all the photographers, and that's are the positions of where the cameras have been pointing to. As you can see, it allows us to reconstruct buildings in 3D, such as the Colosseum, but basically every place in the world. And with this, we can build compasses for decision makers that would inform them to take better decisions. And this brings us now to the Living Earth simulator. And for computer simulation, of course, it is good to have models. These models are tested in comparison with certain phenomena that you observe, and one of these phenomena is actually lane formation. People additionally tend to keep on the right-hand side. All of this can be described by a social force model, so it's basically a set of two different kinds of equation, an equation of motion for pedestrian alpha, which basically says the change in location is given by the speed. Okay, that's not so exciting. But then the question how to specify the change of speed with time means the acceleration. And what we did was we specified a number of different effects in terms of forces and added them up and simulated this. So there's a driving force that describes an adaptation of the actual velocity to a desired speed and desired direction of motion. And then there are interaction forces between pedestrians and interaction forces with boundaries. And this is obviously another technical problem. More information, that's not what I'm interested in at the moment. It's coming back. Okay. Let's look at this. Yeah, so in principle, these equations can be specified in more detail, and it's possible also to look at different kinds of situations. We can, for example, reproduce lane formation very nicely. We can reproduce oscillatory flows at bottlenecks. We can reproduce clogging effects in unidirectional flows at bottlenecks, a so-called faster is slower effect, as it might be important in evacuation situations. And in fact, crowd disasters is one of the problems that we were interested in studying. And as you may know, crowd disasters happened in particular in Saudi Arabia during the Hajj some years back. So every 2 or 3 years there was a serious crowd disaster, and most of them happened here at the Jamra Bridge. The Jamra Bridge contains 3 pillars representing the devil, and so you have to demonstrate that you resist the temptation by the devil by throwing some small pebbles at these pillars. Now, if a lot of people do that at the same time, in fact there are more than 3 million pilgrims per day, then it gets pretty crowded, as you can imagine, and that creates dangerous situations. So what happened was the pillars were replaced by elliptical pillars to create more throwing capacity, but while the Jamra Bridge, the old one, was replaced by the new one, during the preparations for the building process, another crowd disaster happened just at the entrance of the Jamra Bridge on an open plaza. And the question is, how can that happen? I mean, this is actually 40 meters wide. The entire bridge is 80 meters wide, so it's really immense. However, if you analyze video the data, then it turns out that there's a merging of flows, and that created an effective bottleneck. And so, as time progressed, we saw that we had an unexpected transition from smooth flows to stop-and-go flows. These stop-and-go flows looked like this. And it turns out that these stop-and-go flows are an advanced warning sign of a potential crowd disaster. But that's not the only thing that happens, because there's a second unexpected transition from stop-and-go flows to turbulent flows, where people are pushed into all sorts of directions. And that happens when the density is so high that everyone is been squeezed in between others. And so if your body moves a little bit, this transfers forces from your body to other bodies, and these forces may add up and create unpredictable pushes on your body. And in fact, that created a phenomenon that we call crowd turbulence. As you can see over here, people are really pushed around a lot. And so it's just a matter of time until somebody stumbles, falls to the ground, and other people are pushed on top, unfortunately. And so these people are trampled. That's of course very bad, and the question is, what can you do in order to avoid such kind of situations? Well, this is a design issue. And in fact, it turns out that most classical designs of pedestrian facilities are in some sense wrong. So you have corridors, you have bottlenecks, you have intersections. But all of these elements can be improved. So for example, in a corridor you can have obstacles, and while you would think that's not good for the flow, it's actually helping to separate opposite flows, and thereby it's making flows more efficient. So here is an example. Budapest subway station. Now subway arrived. You can see that after a short time the right-hand side is filled with people walking from the front to the back, and the left-hand side is filled with people coming towards us. So we have a very efficient separation of these flow directions, and these pillars that are there for static reasons are helping to separate these flows. At bottlenecks, we can take away some space, and that turns the design into a funnel, and of course then we can very well imagine that such a funnel would work much better than the bottleneck over here. So taking away space can improve things, less can be more, and that's kind of interesting. We observe the same thing also in intersections, so placing obstacles over there could also improve the flow. We just didn't understand it for quite some time. Additionally, if you want to take into account that people have a preferred side of walking, at least in most countries, then you can basically introduce a circular flow. Otherwise, you have a chaos of flows in the intersection area, and you can have different kinds of collective patterns of motion. So we could have dominant flows in these directions, and the perpendicular directions we have to wait, or you could have dominant flows in those directions, and the other direction we have to wait. You could also have clockwise circular flow or counterclockwise circular flows, and you can imagine that none of these patterns is actually stable. So they're all the time destroyed by other collective patterns of motion, and that makes the flow pretty chaotic. So what such a thing does is basically reduce the likelihood of certain patterns of motion and increase the likelihood of a particular pattern of motion, in this case counterclockwise motion. Now, obstacles can also improve the outflow in these kinds of situations that were characterized by clogging effects before. In fact, we did some experiments that actually confirmed this. And similar findings have been made actually for granular materials. Now the question is, could you automatically improve designs for pedestrians? In fact, you can use evolutionary optimization for this. So this is a bottleneck situation, a room with an outlet. And what's happening here is that there are mutations of this design, so sometimes strange things happen, but obviously these designs don't come with a high level of fitness, so they disappear in the course of time. Better designs are reproduced more often. Each design is then again modified by mutations, and eventually, the best designs remain. And as you can see, we get here a particular kind of convex funnel design. And here we have assumed a different approach. We have basically dropped little obstacles and allowed them to aggregate and to respond to the flows. And what we find over here is either zigzag shaped patterns or this indirect outlets, which make sure that there's not too much pressure on the people who are just next to the door, because there are too many people pushing from behind. So these designs basically avoid the clogging effects that we saw before. And for such kind of reasons, actually, we propose that football stadia could be improved. That's today's design, basically. And that's the design that we propose over here. So like a river, the corridors should get wider, the more people can join. The other thing is the zigzag design that we here, which makes sure that not everyone is pushing on these poor people down here, but the pushing direction is interrupted, It's like the crash zone of a vehicle. Now what can we do actually to improve traffic flow? So here is a video that I took in Cairo, and we're now witnessing actually the burst of stop-and-go traffic. There's no traffic lights here. You can see stop-and-go traffic moves backward. And if we zoom in, then it turns out the reason for the stop-and-go traffic is that there are a few cars that are trying to join this freeway over here, and that produces more perturbations. Yeah, we've looked into a lot of data, and data along freeways could look like this. So what you can see over here is velocity shown upside down, so it looks a little bit like a density profile. Density, however, is not so well measurable, so that's why we show velocity over here, along the location of the freeway and in the course of time. To be honest, if I had seen these patterns of traffic when I started to do traffic modeling, I would probably have given up on traffic modeling right away. But it was already too late, so we had published models about traffic flows, and it was a matter of honor to explain what we really see in reality. And so what we did was we identified different elementary congestion patterns, a little bit like in physics where we have elementary particles. And so we attempted to explain all the different congestion patterns that we found as a combination of elementary congestion patterns. And in fact, that works pretty well. So we can produce these elementary patterns even with pretty simple traffic flow models. And that allows us also to make predictions about the conditions under which we find what kind of pattern. So this is the upstream flow on a freeway, upstream of an on-ramp, for example, or another kind of bottleneck. This is the bottleneck strength, for example, the on-ramp flow. And as you can see, the sum of both is basically the traffic volume downstream of the on-ramp. So as we increase the traffic volume, of course we get a congested situation, so that makes a lot of sense. But the interesting point is things also depend on the size of the perturbation. So for small perturbation we find this. For large perturbation we find that. I mean, there are additional patterns, there are localized clusters that can exist, and also these lines are being shifted. And if we cannot measure the size of perturbations, then we have an overlay of these two pictures. Now that's what we actually find within our empirical data. And in fact, that can be considered a great success because this is confirming the theory. Not only this, the theory can also predict actually the extension of congestion patterns and the travel times that people have to spend in addition. So this is a predictive theory, and that's why traffic flow modeling can be considered one of the great successes of complexity science. In particular, as we can also apply this knowledge to improve traffic flow. Not only to give information to drivers about the actual traffic situation or the one which is anticipated in future, but we can actually improve the situation in certain kind of situations, such as disaster situations, but even more. And I will come back to this in a few minutes. So, we've seen pedestrian models, we have seen traffic models. And so the question is, could we come up with other models too? Models for electrical grids, yeah, we have done that. Models for gas pipeline networks, yes, we've done it. So all these kind of things exist. And there are even models for social cooperation, opinion formation, social norms, conflict, and so on. So the idea of Future ICT was to put all these models together, integrate them, and scale them up to global scale. And then eventually increase the degree of detail, as we've done that for weather forecasts. I mean, we still remember the initial weather forecasts were pretty bad, right? But now they're quite reasonable, probabilistic, but very helpful. And every single euro that we invest into weather forecast pays off 10 times. And in fact, there are some nice examples in the area of epidemic spreading and how to respond.
Today's high population densities and intense mobility increasingly threaten to push epidemics to pandemic proportions. The costs of such pandemics can be immense: countless fatalities, untold physical and emotional pain, soaring healthcare costs, and supply chain disruptions. Now, with Glean, we can analyze how infections may spread globally and assess the best ways to minimize their impact. By combining epidemic models with real-world data, Glean produces simulations of the global spread of infectious diseases by integrating 3 layers. The first layer looks at people and their geographic distribution with respect to major transportation hubs. The second layer adds data on the mobility of the people, how they commute, and travel around the globe. The third and final layer adds the epidemic model, which can define complex disease scenarios and response strategies such as vaccination campaigns or emergency travel restrictions. Combining these 3 layers, Glean simulates epidemic spread at a worldwide scale. The resulting forecasts and scenario analyses help inform on how best to counter pandemic threats.
Okay, so this is work that is being done by our Future ICT partners, Alex Vespignani, Victoria Kulitsa, and others, and obviously a very impressive list of people who have contributed to this. So it's almost like an action. All right, but besides creating a mirror world of our actual world, we could also create interactive virtual worlds in order to explore societies and economies that don't actually exist. So we can actually explore different kinds of financial systems, different kinds of voting systems, whatever. So yeah, we could build different worlds in this way, try it out different systems and what are the implications of them before we would implement one of them in our real world. And in fact, there's been a lot of work on interactive serious games as experimental platforms. And of course, laboratory experiments and online experiments, and one of the platforms that we have created actually for online experiments using Amazon Mechanical Turk is NodeGame, and it's open source, and you are welcome actually to contribute to the development of this platform and to use it, of course. Now, big data, however, is not a universal solution, and the reason is basically that we have to consider three curves. The blue curve is processing power. So according to Moore's law, it doubles every 18 months. And that brings us from a situation where we didn't have enough data to take the decisions into a situation where we have a lot of data, big data actually, that can support evidence-based decision making. Because data volume is also exploding, and is actually exploding at a faster pace. It doubles every 12 months approximately. And as a result, there is a gap that opens up between data volume and processing power. So there's a certain fraction of data that's increasing over time even, which could be called dark data, because you'll never be able to process these data. And that creates something like a flashlight effect. That means we could look at anything in the data that we have, but we need to decide what to look at. So the serious issue here is, do we pay attention to the right kind of things? There are many examples that demonstrate this is not the case actually. Besides, there's systemic complexity. So as we go on networking the world, we create new things, and these new things can again be networked with these other things in the world, and it creates a combinatorial complexity, and that's exploding even faster. And it's like a factorial function, and as a result, actually, top-down control wouldn't work. Yeah? I think we are already in that kind of situation where it works less and less well. And so we need to come up with new paradigms, and the paradigm that I think will become more and more important in the future is self-organization and distributed control. So one could say, as the complexity of the system increases, we need to have a higher level of autonomy in order to achieve our goals well. And in fact, we can see a trend towards decentralized, bottom-up organized systems everywhere. In traffic control, where we started off with traffic control centers and telematic approaches, while today we're talking about distributed approaches like car-to-car communication and so on. With peer-to-peer money like Bitcoin, peer-to-peer lending, and even a change in the peer revenue system. We have now taxis that are replaced by Uber. We have a change from human supervised driving to self-driving cars, from robots to intelligent swarms, and so on. So a lot of changes hinting towards more distributed control. And that also implies actually that we need to have more participation in future. So as we need to have more distributed control, it means that we need to have more influence on what decisions are being taken in our world. And in fact, that's an experience that the chief designer of New York City has made. He's written this very nice book. And he says that successful urban design requires the right combination of top-down and bottom-up involvement. He further says that he could not control anything, but he could influence everything. And this is how we should think about the management of complex systems in future. And in fact, here is another example. So I've organized a hackathon on earthquake resilience in San Francisco. And as you know, disaster response uses to be a pretty much top-down controlled systems, almost a military kind of system. But those people during the hackathon came up with completely different approaches, which were a combination of top-down and bottom-up. So basically it came down to government saying, okay, we need this, this, and this, like so and so much fuel, so and so much water, and so much many clothes. And then the question is, who could actually help to supply this? In fact, they developed several solutions, and the 3 award-winning solutions were those. Amigo Cloud allowed people to take pictures of collapsed bridges, broken infrastructures, and so on. And as soon as there was connectivity, that information would be uploaded to an information platform. Now, of course, the communication system could be broken down, as we've seen before. That's quite typical for a disaster. But if we use ad hoc networks, mesh nets, FireChat, for example, smartphones could just talk to each other. In this way, communication could still continue. But after some time, we would have to charge our smartphones, so that's why we need these charge beacons. It's basically local places with solar panels where people would need to charge their phones, so they could discuss the situation, what they can do. And finally, Helping Hands would be an app that allows people to say what they need and other people to say what they can help. In this way, it would actually allow people to help themselves and each other. Now, altogether, one could say that we can get towards self-organizing systems if we create the suitable kind of feedback loops. And that could be also done on multiple levels. So if you think about the entirety of society, then I imagine that we would have this organization on multiple levels and not a top-down control where one huge computer system would try to control every single person's decisions and actions. In order to come up with the right kind of feedback loops, however, we need to understand how these socioeconomic systems work, and we can use the underlying forces for us, and we can do something almost like engineering. As we've learned to use natural forces, I think we can use also social forces for us. We just haven't understood it well enough in the past. And in fact, here are a number of examples. So, how should we go about congestion? Well, in fact, we worked with Volkswagen on driver assistance systems. Cars are now getting smarter and smarter. They have a perception, they can communicate with each other, they can figure out the situation they're in, they can take decisions, and particularly they could change their driving style depending on the situation they're in, which they figure out by car-to-car communication. And so, for example, they could change their time gaps to the car ahead, they could change their acceleration or deceleration in order to change the collective outcome. The interesting point is that such a system is effective even if not all cars are equipped with this kind of system. So even with just 20% of system, this becomes effective for everyone. And for 40% equipped vehicles, you get rid of the entire congestion almost. This is pretty interesting, and here is an illustration of this. So at the moment we're visualizing this annoying stop-and-go traffic that we're suffering from every day, basically. And first we have to figure out what's actually the reason for this, and we'll see by beaming ourselves out of this car that there is an on-ramp, pretty much as in the Cairo situation, where there are few cars that want to get on the freeway, and this causes small disruptions in the traffic flow. These small disruptions are being amplified and then eventually that causes stop-and-go traffic. Now, assume all the cars are equipped with radar sensors that measure the distances and relative velocities. We use that information to let the cars drive automatically in a slightly adapted way. And as you can see over here, we can do that in a way that actually stabilizes traffic flow and increases the capacity. So we can get rid of traffic jams. This is possible just by changing the interactions, by changing the feedbacks between the cars. I've done a similar thing actually to overcome crowd disasters. So this is the new Jamrad bridge that has been built, and it has a number of interesting features, but the most important point is really real-time feedback. So they now measure how many people are on the way towards the Jamrad bridge and back. So there's a real-time monitoring, and there is an adaptive rerouting strategy in case there is a danger of some overload. There are also contingency plans in case something goes wrong. So they're now prepared for all sorts of things. And that changed the situation from this one, where emergency vehicles couldn't really reach the people in need, towards a very well-organized situation, as you can see over here. Now, in the meantime, there are also interesting new possibilities to use smartphones in order to advise you during a crowd event, during a festival, what to do. So basically, you would donate your GPS data to a computer server that's run by scientists in this case, and they would aggregate this data, and the aggregated data would be provided to the management of this event, and in this way it would be possible to respond to the situation which is out there. And there's also a movie that I wanted to show you. So this is one of the projects that was done within Socionical and the preparation of the future ICT. So the main point is that the information that's jointly generated is fed back to the user, so they would get useful information. And as you can see from all these smartphones, we can basically reconstruct the local situation. We'll see that there is overload in some places, and that kind of information would then be actually provided back to the user. So that's during the Lord Mayor show in London. Just in a moment, you'll see there will be a warning that one of the subway stations is overloaded. Yeah, here we go, subway congestion. Sending messages to users, and this is what's happening right now. That festival goer is actually getting this information and it's telling you, okay, maybe you should use this other subway station. Okay, self-organization and self-regulation are approaches which can master the complexity of today's systems and benefit from it. So we will basically replace this over-regulated system by designs that would actually support people to do the right kind of thing. And here is a funny example. Very heterogeneous, so pedestrians, car drivers, bicycles, even horses, donkeys, camels, and so on. And the question is, why is this working so well? Of course, most of the time people don't have to stop. And it turns out that this is because we have a unidirectional flow in the front, you have an opposite unidirectional flow in the back, and you have a small buffer in between, so that allows people to adjust the speed in such a way that they would just arrive at the point in time when there is a gap for them to cross. So it's that simple, just a design issue. And then the question is, could we design our entire world actually in a way that we would more or less automatically do things that would create a coordinated, cooperative solution? And I actually think we can do this now, 300 years after this idea has been formulated in books like this one, 1714, as you can see. Of course, it's known as the phenomenon of the invisible hand by Adam Smith and others, and this is how we imagine it to work. Where unfortunately, it doesn't always work. So it often fails. There's environmental pollution, there's overfishing, there's climate change, and many other problems, financial crisis, and so on. But what I'm claiming is that now we'll have the technology and science to make the invisible hand work for us. It takes complexity science and takes data generated by the Internet of Things that allows us to create real-time feedbacks in the way that we need in order for the systems to do a good job. And self-organization can be very resource efficient and resilient to perturbation. So we had this. Let's look into the example of urban traffic flow, traffic light control. It's a terribly difficult problem. It's an NP-hard optimization problem, actually. And so traffic control centers, even with a supercomputer, cannot do the optimization in real time. Not a strict optimization. So they do a simplification, and basically the idea is that each intersection is operated in a cyclical way, and these cycles are being synchronized, and doesn't that sound good? So that's what people do. And then actually the cycles are slightly adjusted too, but in principle you have a periodic operation, yeah, for certain time slots. It turns out, however, that a non-periodic solution could be more efficient because there's a lot of variability of the traffic flows that arrive. So, what to do in order to understand the system? First of all, we need to model, of course, what's happening along the roads. And we can use over here the continuity equation or Lytle-Wissem model with a triangular fundamental diagram. That's an approximation or simplification, but it's actually good enough for urban traffic flow. And if we do that, actually we can derive delay differential equations and all sorts of equations that allow us to calculate what's happening inside the homogeneous road section if you just consider the inflow and the outflow. Moreover, we then have to encode the intersection designs, right? So for a single intersection design, it could look like this, pretty complicated, but today you can get all the data on a DVD, and in this way, it's not so complicated to simulate an entire city. You just need to come up with the way how these different road sections are to be connected, and of course there's something like Kirchhoff's law, a conservation of the flows, and it's a little bit tricky, and in particular there are these kind of minimum functions in them, which basically says that whatever we do wrong, it reduces our flow. Yeah? So we'd like to avoid these minimum functions to jump in, and that basically requires that we wouldn't have this kind of situation where one road is full and it creates spillover effects and blocks other kinds of flows. Yeah, we would certainly also have to consider how to model traffic lights. This is done by a permeability that switches between 0 and 1. 0 when there's a red light, 1 when there's a green light. And then the job is really to coordinate neighboring intersections. Because what we want to avoid is that cars would have to stop several times. However, as it turns out, you can make many mistakes, and that would create basically additional travel times, and additional travel times means more congestion in the system, and that increases the travel times further, right? So the question is how to manage the complexity in a bottom-up way based on self-organization and distributed control. And actually, we have been inspired by this observation over here. This is a simulation of pedestrian flows at bottlenecks, and you can see an oscillatory flow behavior that's based actually on a pressure principle. And so we thought by ourselves, this looks pretty much as if it would be controlled by a pedestrian traffic light. So couldn't we use the same principle to control traffic lights? Could we have the traffic flows control the traffic lights rather than the other way around? And this is what we did. And in fact, it turns out that it produces a pretty reasonable traffic light control. And this can be very effective. So what we've done is we compared top-down control by a traffic control center with bottom-up self-organization. And this one just minimizes travel times for each intersection. That means every single intersection takes separate decisions. And it's like Homo economicus, everyone just does the best for himself. And this time minimize travel times. Now, there's a third traffic light control that we've been looking at, which does the same thing with one difference. When there's a long queue, then travel time minimization is interrupted, and instead we first clear long queues. So you would think that's probably the best solution, that's the second best, and that's the third best. But it turns out it's very different from this. So what do we find? We look at the queue length of vehicles as a function of the utilization of the intersection capacity. Then for top-down regulation, we find the red line, so a linear increase of the queue length with utilization. That makes a lot of sense. For the selfish optimization, however, we find much shorter queue lengths. That means, like in free markets, there is a very efficient outcome. However, this invisible hand kind of coordination only works up to here, and then suddenly queue lengths explode, and the traffic center actually works better. So over here, the invisible hand actually fails. And that's of course why we have traffic centers. But surprisingly, this third approach that was interrupting minimization of travel times to pay attention to neighboring intersections is doing better all the way, even though this is a distributed approach. So we can say that bottom-up self-regulation can outsmart optimal top-down control. We can make the invisible hand work. And so in this way we can get really beautiful green waves in a system, and not only in such an idealized system as this Manhattan network. We find very interesting patterns, and in particular what we find is that our new approach is more resistant to variability of inflows because it responds more flexibly. It can also handle arterial flows much better. It creates green waves, but it doesn't impose a certain pattern on the flows. It just uses basically gaps in the flow as opportunities, and that creates a nice coordination between neighboring intersections. And in fact, even in a network, we find a much better outcome for this new kind of self-control. And it's not just theoretical, this has also been applied to real-world cities, such as Dresden, for example. So the traffic authority was very unhappy with the traffic control in this center, which is very complex. And they wanted to have green waves in the same time of prioritization of public transportation. Of course, that was not consistent with each other. The problem is that there are a lot of trams and buses, and if you prioritize them, you would basically destroy any green wave, and if you do that, that would cause really large-scale congestion in the city. But we managed to come up with a more efficient traffic light control. The South Control was producing these beautiful green bands, and more importantly, actually, it increased the outcomes. And actually, for all modes of transport, I mean, for public transport, for individualized traffic, and pedestrians and cyclists. And it's better for the environment too. So this is just one example how we actually can manage complex network system in a better way, in a distributed way, based on synchronization. And we could, of course, apply similar principles to electrical grids, to smart grids, and also to systems that bring different kinds of networks together. And this is actually what is the challenge ahead. And so, if you think this is what we should have, then spread the word, help work on it, and then this idea will hopefully spread all over the world. Thank you very much.